Hello, Larson Halleck here, and it is the revival of Manthropology. I'm so terribly sorry you had to wait 7 whole weeks for a new Manthropology episode, because I know you were all waiting for it. In all seriousness, my life has been in a little bit of a flux recently. Me and my girlfriend broke up, I got a new job, I was forcibly resigned from the job, and then I got another new job, which is why the last few videos have been either really short, non-labor intensive, or both. Even as my life temporarily hits the skids, I still provide you people content every week, and I really hope you appreciate it. Sorry, I believe we're supposed to be discussing anthropology. So in this day and age of immigration debate, a long-standing argument against any sort of restriction in settler nations like the USA and Canada, and increasingly elsewhere, is something along the lines of, "Actually, you took land from other people, so therefore you have no right to complain." This is also a long-standing mockery of Europeans towards the USA in general, perhaps one that will be in something of a decline now that it's being used against them. Let's make something perfectly clear. Of course America was built by one group of people coming in and conquering another group of people. Nobody's denying that. But the title of this video says it all. The amount of countries that didn't have, at some point in its history, one group of people coming in and shit-slapping the inhabitants that were already there can basically be counted on 2 hands, if at all. Don't believe me? Let's take a look. Of course, there's the USA, and the obvious other colonizer nations that get guilt-tripped regularly, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and wouldn't you know it, they're all Anglosphere countries, what a coincidence. There's also every single Latin American country, as much as they try to deny it and claim purely Indian ancestry. Hungary, Turkey, Finland, Scandinavia, Russia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Japan, China, Taiwan, Iceland, Israel, the United Kingdom, Greece, the entirety of the Muslim world. When I mentioned Afghanistan previously, I was referring to the Seleucid Hellenic conquest, and about half of sub-Saharan Africa. Oh, would you look at that map. Just naming countries off the top of my head, without doing any research, I filled up the majority of this map. Look how much of the damn planet was built on conquest. If I had actually bothered to do some research, I could probably fill in the majority of those unmarked countries, but I like to pretend that my college education was worth something. I'm just going off what I learned there. Looking at that map again, yeah, America's totally unique in its conquest because, from what I've seen, people who complain about Indians, I'm of course referring to savvy immigrants and immigrant boosters who know how to play the game, and not self-pitying white cucks who genuinely believe in the white guilt ideology, will do one of 2 things. Either ignore their homeland's history of conquest completely, or try to claim that it was somehow less bad than the Indian Wars. Dot Indians, for example, will sometimes try to claim that there were in fact no Aryan conquest at all, and that the light-skinned, high-caste people and the Sanskrit language were indigenous to the subcontinent, despite all genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence to the contrary. As a side note, the most absurd example of this whitewashing happening was something that happened in my own private life. An Australian exchange student that I was having a not-so-pleasant conversation with started whining about Indians and what have you. When I called her out on how her own country has a colonial history basically identical to my own, she stammered a bit, and then claimed that the conquest of the USA was somehow worse because the Native Americans, and I quote, had culture that was destroyed by the evil paleface. The implication being that the Abos didn't have any culture and therefore it was less bad to kill them. I'll let you think about that for yourself. Since we are on the topic of justifying and or whitewashing conquest, let's talk about a highly related issue. As ubiquitous as conquest itself is the making up of some mythology to justify conquest. Of course, we all know about things like Manifest Destiny and the White Man's Burden in Laban's Realm. Those are all examples of what are essentially nationalist mythologies meant to clear the conscience of the possible bad feelings you might have about taking another man's shit. However, before you all start thinking that only the evil Christian white man does it, let's look at a few other examples. Most notably, what is Zionism if not a conqueror's mythology? You have a religion that claims that God promised you this land. So what if 2,000 years have gone by since any of you have lived there? Next year in Jerusalem, bitch! Similarly, Han Chinese settlers to Taiwan would openly refer to the Formosan Aborigines as being either uncivilized or civilized, depending on whether or not they had adopted Confucian, Neo-Confucian, or whatever cultural and religious norms. Similarly, when the Japanese took over Formosa, they would force said indigenes to acculturate to their culture. G. Forcing primitive indigenes to become civilized by the standards of the conqueror? One might call that a yellow man's burden, but that'd be ridiculous. In Rwanda, the Congo, and the other historical ranges of the Tutsi people, they have their own religious mythology for why they should rule over the Hutus and the Twa Pygmies. One of their gods had 3 sons, a Pygmy son, a Hutu son, and a Tutsi son. He gave each of them a gourd of milk apiece and told them to watch it overnight. The Twa son gulped it right down and was banished to the forest. The Hutu started to guard it, but then fell asleep instead of watching over it the whole night. But the Tutsi son stood guard over the milk all night, and he was rewarded by being put in charge of the place by his god dad, because he was responsible, you see. Then, of course, that conqueror myth ran into a bigger, stronger conqueror myth, that of the white man's burden in the 1800s. And then things got really bad after that. But the point I'm trying to make is the language of Rwanda, Kinyarwanda, is a Bantu group language. Undoubtedly, over the millennia that the Bantu expansion took place, there were many other conquering mythologies. Sadly, the dearth of written languages in the area makes that just a speculation. As of right now, the modern illegal immigration/refugee racket seems to me to be itself a mode of conquest, with their own conquerors' mythologies. When illegals to the US start with their "the border crossed us, viva Aslan" nonsense, what is that if not a conqueror's mythology, justifying irredentist claims to the land? And similarly, the push for European historical figures to be portrayed as ambiguously swarthy, if not outright black, seems to be a way to justify the seizing of European lands by our dusky brethren. And let's not get into the Cheddar Man phenomenon, where our societal betters will outright say, "Actually, black people were in England before English people," again fudging science for an ideological purpose. Is it wrong for white people to resist their lands being handed over by their societal betters? No, and guess what? It wasn't wrong for American Indians or any other indigenes to fight back against their dispossession. And it wasn't wrong for the people they conquered to fight back against them, and so on and so forth. And thus we come back to what I've always said. Either everybody should be guilt-tripped and shamed for their past misdoings, or nobody should be. Applying it selectively is, well, if you think about it, it's yet another way for people to justify conquest. An inheritance of guilt, which nullifies your right to the land. I'm Larson Halleck, and I appreciate humanity in all of its splendor, but not inane conquest myths.
And now a word from our sponsors. Hey folks, are you a fan of Larson Halleck and the Barbaric Gentleman? Of course you are, otherwise you wouldn't be watching. Do you want to help me out somehow? If so, here's how you can give me money. You can go to patreon.com/LarsonHalleck and give me some money. Or you can donate to me via PayPal, paypal.me/LarsonHalleck. Or buy my book. Otherwise visit my Gab, my Twitter, and keep watching the videos.